Emily Dawson was a name few people noticed. In the quiet little town of Willow Creek, she was just another face in the crowd. No one paid much attention to the girl with plain brown hair, hand-me-down clothes, and a quiet demeanor. She wasn't the class clown, the sports star, or the one with big dreams plastered all over their notebooks. At 16, Emily had mastered the art of blending into the background. She wasn't invisible, exactly, she was just easy to overlook. At school, she sat in the back row, her head bent over her books. She didn't mind eating lunch alone in the corner of the cafeteria. The noise of the other kids laughing and shouting faded into the background for her. She had learned to tune it all out. It was easier that way. Emily was used to people overlooking her, and in some ways, it was a comfort. No one asked her too many questions. No one expected too much. Her life was simple. Each day followed the same routine: wake up, help her mom get ready for her early shift at the diner, pack her lunch, and walk to school. The afternoons were for studying or part-time work at the town library, and the evenings were for reading and helping her younger brother with his homework. Nothing exciting ever happened in Willow Creek, or to Emily, for that matter. But sometimes, life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. One small moment, one split-second decision, can change everything. For Emily, that moment came on a chilly Monday afternoon, with a simple act of kindness that would ripple through her life in ways she couldn't have imagined. It had been a long day at school. Emily had spent most of it trying to ignore the whispers and giggles from the other kids. They always found something to comment on: her old shoes, her oversized sweater, or the way she quietly slipped out of group activities. She told herself it didn't bother her, but deep down, it did. As the final bell rang, Emily packed up her things and walked out into the crisp autumn air. The streets were lined with red and gold leaves, and the town had the faint smell of smoke from fireplaces warming up against the chill. She clutched her lunchbox tightly. It was old and scratched, a leftover from when her dad still lived with them. She hadn't eaten much of her lunch that day, partly because she wasn't very hungry and partly because she didn't like sitting in the cafeteria for too long. The walk home was one she had taken 100 times before. It was peaceful, with the sounds of birds chirping and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. But as she passed the bus stop near the corner of Maple Street, something made her pause. There, sitting on the bench, was a man. His clothes were worn and layered, with patches and tears that told a story of hard times. A battered cardboard sign rested against his knees. It read, "Hungry? Anything helps." Emily's first instinct was to keep walking. She had seen people like him before, men and women on the streets, asking for help. The town was small, but even here, there were those who struggled to make ends meet. Most people hurried past, pretending not to see them. But something about this man made Emily stop. It wasn't just the way he looked, though the dark circles under his eyes and the way he held his arms close to his body against the cold tugged at her heart. It was his eyes. They weren't just tired, they were full of something else. A story, maybe. A kind of quiet pain that seemed to reach out and pull at her. Emily hesitated for a moment. She wasn't sure what to do. She didn't have any money with her, and even if she did, she knew her mom wouldn't be happy about her giving it away. Money was tight enough as it was. But then she remembered her lunchbox. Inside was half a sandwich, a few apple slices, and a small pack of crackers. It wasn't much, but it was something. She looked down at the lunchbox, then back at the man. Before she could second-guess herself, Emily stepped forward. The man noticed her, his gaze lifting from the ground. His eyes widened slightly, as if surprised that someone had stopped. "Here," she said, holding out the lunchbox. The man blinked, his weathered face softening. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice hoarse but kind. Emily nodded. "It's not much, but it's all I have right now. For a moment, he just looked at her, as if he couldn't believe what she was doing. Then he took the lunchbox with shaking hands. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily offered a small smile. "Take care," she said, and then she turned and walked away. She didn't look back, though part of her wanted to. Something about the encounter stayed with her as she made her way home. It wasn't just the man's gratitude, it was the feeling that she had done something right, something meaningful. As she walked through the door of her small house, Emily pushed the moment to the back of her mind. There was homework to do, dinner to help with, and her little brother to keep an eye on. Life went on, as it always did. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that this small act of kindness was the first domino in a chain reaction. By the next day, her life would be anything but ordinary. The world she knew was about to be turned upside down, all because she gave her lunchbox to a stranger. Emily didn't tell anyone about the man at the bus stop. Not her mom, not her little brother, Tyler, and certainly not anyone at school. It wasn't that she wanted to keep it a secret, she just didn't think it was worth mentioning. To her, it was a small gesture, nothing extraordinary. But that night, as she lay in bed, the man's face lingered in her thoughts. She tried to focus on the homework she hadn't finished or the upcoming math quiz, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw his eyes. They weren't like anyone else's she'd ever seen. They held a weight, like he was carrying something far heavier than hunger or cold. "Why can't I stop thinking about him?" Emily whispered to herself, staring up at the cracks in her ceiling. Tyler's soft snores filled the small bedroom they shared. She turned on her side, pulling the blanket up to her chin, and tried to shake the feeling. It was probably nothing. People had tough lives, and he was just one of many. Still, something gnawed at her, a feeling she couldn't quite name. The next morning, Emily woke up to the sound of rain tapping against the window. She stretched and yawned, rubbing her eyes as she sat up. Tyler was still asleep, his small frame curled up under the blankets. She tiptoed around the room, careful not to wake him, and quickly got ready for school. Her mom was already gone, having left early for her shift at the diner. There was a note on the kitchen counter. "Leftovers in the fridge. Have a good day at school. Love you." Emily smiled faintly, folding the note and tucking it into her pocket. Her mom always wrote little notes like that, even on the busiest mornings. It was her way of reminding Emily and Tyler that, no matter how hard things got, they were loved. By the time Emily stepped outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. She pulled her hood up and walked quickly, her lunchbox swinging at her side. For a moment, she considered taking a different route to school. She wasn't sure why, but the thought of passing the bus stop again made her stomach flutter. But curiosity won out. As she approached the corner of Maple Street, her heart beat a little faster. She told herself it was silly. The man probably wasn't there anymore. Still, she couldn't stop herself from looking. The bench was empty. Emily let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She felt a mix of relief and disappointment. Part of her had hoped to see him again, if only to know that he was okay. But the bus stop was just as it always was, quiet and unremarkable, with nothing out of the ordinary. She shook her head, chiding herself for overthinking. It was just a random act of kindness, she thought. Nothing more. The school day passed in its usual blur of classes and whispers. Emily kept her head down, as she always did, trying to avoid the attention of her classmates. At lunch, she sat alone in the corner of the cafeteria, nibbling on a sandwich while pretending to read a book. A group of girls walked by, their laughter ringing out as they passed her table. "Hey, Emily," one of them called, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Reading another one of your nerdy books?" Emily didn't respond. She stared at the page in front of her, though she hadn't read a single word. Leave her alone, another girl said, though her tone was more amused than concerned. The group moved on, their laughter fading into the background. Emily sighed, closing her book. She wasn't upset, she was used to it by now. People like them didn't matter. They didn't know her, not really. What mattered was getting through the day, one class at a time. By the time the final bell rang, Emily was more than ready to go home. She packed up her things and started the familiar walk back, the cool autumn air nipping at her cheeks. As she turned onto Maple Street, she saw them two police cars parked by the bus stop. Her steps slowed. She couldn't see much from where she stood, but there were two officers talking to an older woman who lived nearby. One of them was jotting something down in a notebook, while the other scanned the area with a serious expression. Emily's heart began to race. What was going on? She considered crossing the street to avoid the scene, but her curiosity got the better of her. She walked past the bus stop, keeping her head down but sneaking a glance out of the corner of her eye. The bench was still empty, but there was something on the ground, a small, crumpled piece of cardboard. Emily recognized it immediately. It was the man's sign. Her mind raced with questions. Had something happened to him? Was he in trouble? She wanted to stop and ask the officers, but she didn't know what to say. Would they even listen to her? She was just a kid. Instead, she kept walking, her thoughts spinning. By the time she got home, the sense of unease had settled into a heavy knot in her stomach. She tried to push it aside, telling herself it wasn't her problem. But the image of the empty bench and the discarded sign stayed with her. That night, as she sat at the kitchen table helping Tyler with his homework, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Tyler's voice broke through her thoughts. Huh? She blinked, looking down at the math worksheet in front of her. You're staring off into space again, he said, tilting his head. Are you okay? Yeah, she said quickly, forcing a smile. Just tired, that's all. He didn't look convinced, but he didn't press her. After dinner, Emily lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't stop thinking about the man at the bus stop. Who was he? Where had he gone? And why were the police there? She replayed their brief encounter in her mind, trying to make sense of it. She remembered his eyes, the way they had looked at her with a mix of gratitude and something else, something she couldn't quite put into words. Her mom always told her not to get involved in other people's problems. You've got enough on your plate, she would say. But this felt different. Emily didn't know why, but she had a feeling this wasn't the end of the story. And she was right. The next day, everything would change. The next day started like any other. Emily woke up to the faint hum of her alarm clock, the sound barely cutting through the muffled voices of her mom and little brother in the kitchen. She rubbed her eyes and stretched, trying to shake off the lingering weight of sleep. Emily, breakfast is ready, her mom called. Coming, she shouted back, though her voice lacked enthusiasm. She pulled on the same thrift store sweater she'd worn countless times before. It was a little too big and frayed at the sleeves, but it was warm, and that was what mattered. The mirror in the corner of her room showed a tired girl with plain brown hair and a face that looked older than 16. Emily didn't linger in front of the mirror. She never liked what she saw. The morning passed uneventfully. Tyler asked for help tying his shoes, her mom reminded her to take her lunchbox, and the walk to school was as quiet as usual. But as soon as Emily stepped into the school building, the familiar noise hit her: laughter, shouting, lockers slamming shut. She kept her head down, weaving through the crowd toward her first class. Hey, Emily, a voice called out. She didn't need to look to know who it was. Rachel Stevens. The queen bee of the school. Perfect hair, perfect clothes, and a perfectly sharp tongue. Emily's stomach tightened as Rachel and her group of friends caught up to her. Nice sweater, Rachel said, her voice dripping with mock kindness. What thrift store did you find that in? Or did your mom sew it herself? Laughter erupted from the group. Emily felt the heat rise to her cheeks, but she didn't stop walking. Charity case, one of the girls whispered loudly, just enough for Emily to hear. Emily's grip on her lunchbox tightened, but she kept her head down. She wasn't going to let them see that their words stung. What did they know about her life? About her mom working double shifts at the diner just to keep the bills paid? About how she stretched every dollar to make sure Tyler had what he needed for school? They didn't know anything. And they wouldn't understand even if she told them. Emily slipped into her classroom, letting out a shaky breath as the door closed behind her. The teacher was already at the board, writing out the day's lesson. She took her usual seat in the back row, hoping to disappear into the background. The day dragged on, each class blending into the next. At lunch, Emily sat alone at her usual table in the far corner of the cafeteria. She unwrapped her sandwich, but her appetite was gone. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the man at the bus stop. She wondered where he was, if he had eaten since she gave him her lunchbox. Why am I thinking about this so much? She muttered under her breath. The cafeteria was loud, filled with the chatter of students who seemed worlds apart from her. She envied how carefree they all seemed. For Emily, life was a constant balancing act: school, work, home, and making sure Tyler never felt the weight of the struggles she and her mom carried. The rest of the day passed in a blur. By the time the final bell rang, Emily was exhausted. She packed her things and walked out into the crisp afternoon air, relieved to leave the school behind. But as she walked home, she noticed something strange. The street felt different. It was quieter than usual. The sounds of kids playing in their yards, dogs barking, and car engines idling were absent. A chill ran down her spine as she turned onto her block. That's when she saw them. Blue and red lights flashed against the gray sky, reflecting off the windows of her house. Police cars were parked in the driveway and along the street. Neighbors stood on their porches, whispering to one another, their faces filled with curiosity and concern. Emily's heart began to race. "What's going on?" she whispered, quickening her pace. As she got closer, she saw her mom standing on the front porch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with worry. "Mom!" Emily called out, her voice trembling. Her mom turned to her, but before she could say anything, a tall police officer stepped forward. He had a stern face, his dark uniform crisp and imposing. "Emily Dawson?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Emily froze. She clutched her lunchbox tightly, her knuckles turning white. "Yes," she said, barely above a whisper. The officer exchanged a glance with another officer standing nearby before looking back at her. "We need to talk," he said. Emily's mind raced. Why were they here? What had she done? Her thoughts immediately went to Tyler. Was he okay? "What's going on?" she asked, her voice shaking. The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he gestured toward the porch. "Let's go inside," he said. Emily hesitated, but her mom placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay," her mom said, though her voice was tight. "Let's hear what they have to say." Inside, the living room felt smaller than usual, crowded with officers and their serious expressions. Tyler peeked out from behind the couch, his eyes wide with fear. Emily gave him a small, reassuring nod, even though she didn't feel reassured herself. "Is this about the man at the bus stop?" Emily blurted out, the question escaping her before she could stop it. The officer's eyebrows lifted slightly. "What man?" Emily swallowed hard. I gave him my lunch yesterday. He was sitting at the bus stop with a sign that said he was hungry. Did something happen to him?" The room was silent for a moment. Then the officer exchanged another look with his partner. "We're looking into a situation," he said carefully. "We just need to ask you a few questions." Emily's mom stepped forward. "She's just a kid," she said, her voice firm. "What kind of questions?" The officer hesitated, glancing down at his notebook. "We have reason to believe that your daughter may have been in contact with someone involved in an ongoing investigation. We just need to clarify a few things." Emily felt a lump form in her throat. "I don't understand," she said. "What investigation? He was just a homeless man. I was trying to help." The officer's expression softened slightly, but his tone remained serious. "Sometimes, things aren't what they seem," he said. "Did the man say anything to you? Did he give you anything?" Emily shook her head quickly. "No. He just said thank you. That's all." Her mom tightened her grip on Emily's shoulder. "If you think my daughter did something wrong—" "No one's saying she did," the officer interrupted gently. "We're just trying to piece together what happened." "What happened?" Emily repeated, her voice rising. "What are you talking about? Did something happen to him?" The officer hesitated again, as if choosing his words carefully. "The man you described is someone we've been looking for. He may be connected to a larger case. That's all we can say for now." Emily's mind reeled. Connected to a case? What did that even mean? Her mom pulled her closer, her voice shaking now. "She's just a kid," she said again. "Whatever this is, she didn't do anything wrong." "We're not accusing her of anything," the officer said. "We just need to understand what happened." Emily felt like the walls were closing in around her. She had thought she was helping someone in need, but now it felt like she was being dragged into something much bigger and much scarier than she could have imagined. She looked up at her mom, searching for answers, but all she saw was the same confusion and fear she felt. The officer closed his notebook and offered a small, almost apologetic smile. "Thank you for your time," he said. "If we need anything else, we'll be in touch." As the officers left, Emily sank onto the couch, her legs trembling. Tyler crawled over to her, his small hands clutching her sleeve. "What's happening, Em?" he whispered. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely audible. "I don't know." But deep down, she had a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning. The police cars pulled away one by one, their flashing lights fading into the evening. Emily sat on the couch, her lunchbox still clutched in her lap, her mind racing with questions. Tyler leaned against her, his wide eyes searching her face for reassurance, but she had none to offer. Her mom paced back and forth, muttering under her breath. "I don't understand. What could they possibly want with you? This doesn't make any sense." "I don't know, Mom," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was just trying to help." Her mom stopped pacing and turned to her, her expression softening. "I know, sweetheart. You have such a big heart. But sometimes the world isn't kind to people who try to do the right thing." Emily blinked back tears. She had only wanted to make someone's day a little better. How could something so small turn into something so frightening? Tyler tugged on her sleeve. "Are the police gonna come back?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I don't think so," Emily said, though she wasn't sure. "It's okay, Ty. Everything's fine." But it didn't feel fine. That night, Emily lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment from the day before. The man at the bus stop. His tired eyes. The way he had smiled when she handed him her lunchbox. She couldn't imagine him being dangerous. He had looked so vulnerable, so beaten down by life. How could he be connected to something that required police involvement? She turned over and stared at the faint glow of the street light filtering through her window. Sleep felt impossible. The next morning, Emily woke up to the sound of her mom talking on the phone. She couldn't make out the words, but her mom's voice sounded strained. When she came into the kitchen, her mom ended the call quickly and turned to her with a forced smile. "Morning, sweetie. You want some toast?" Emily narrowed her eyes. "Who were you talking to?" "No one important," her mom said, brushing off the question. "Just a friend." Emily wasn't convinced, but she didn't push. She sat at the table and picked at her toast, her appetite non-existent. At school, the day felt heavier than usual. Rachel and her friends were as cruel as ever, but their jabs barely registered. Emily's thoughts were elsewhere, consumed by the mystery of the man at the bus stop and the police's strange visit. By lunchtime, her nerves were frayed. She sat at her usual table in the corner, her lunch untouched. She couldn't stop thinking about the officer's words, "Sometimes, things aren't what they seem." "Emily." The voice startled her, pulling her out of her thoughts. She looked up to see Mrs. Carter, one of the school counselors, standing by her table. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Mrs. Carter asked, her tone gentle but serious. Emily nodded and followed her to the counseling office. Inside, Mrs. Carter gestured for her to sit down. "Emily, I heard there was some activity at your house yesterday. Is everything okay?" Emily hesitated. She didn't know how much to say or even what to say. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "The police were there. They said they needed to talk to me about someone I met yesterday. A man at the bus stop." Mrs. Carter leaned forward, her expression concerned. "What did they say about him?" "Not much," Emily said. "Just that he might be involved in something. But I don't know what." Mrs. Carter nodded slowly. "Emily, I want you to know that if you ever need help or someone to talk to, I'm here." "Okay." Emily managed a small nod. "Thanks," she said, though the words felt hollow. The rest of the day passed in a blur. By the time Emily got home, her mom was waiting for her with a worried look. "Emily," her mom said as she walked through the door. "There's something I need to tell you." Emily froze. "What is it?" Her mom hesitated, glancing toward Tyler, who was playing with his toys in the corner. "Let's talk in the kitchen," she said. Emily followed her, her stomach twisting with anxiety. Once they were alone, her mom took a deep breath. "The man you gave your lunch to yesterday, he's been in the news." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Her mom pulled out her phone and opened a news article. The headline read, "Police seek man connected to high-profile investigation." Below it was a grainy photo of the man from the bus stop. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "That's him," she whispered. Her mom nodded. "They're saying he might have information about something important. Something dangerous." Emily sank into a chair, her mind spinning. How could this be happening? She had only wanted to help. "They're not saying he's a criminal," her mom added quickly. "But they think he knows something. That's why the police came to talk to you. They're trying to find him." Emily buried her face in her hands. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice shaking. "I know you didn't," her mom said, wrapping an arm around her. "You were just being kind. But sometimes, kindness can lead to things we don't expect." Emily looked up at her mom, her eyes filled with tears. "What am I supposed to do now?" Her mom sighed. "For now, we just wait. If the police need more information, we'll talk to them. But you didn't do anything wrong, Emily. Remember that." That night, Emily lay in bed, her thoughts racing. The man's face haunted her. She had seen something in his eyes, something that told her he wasn't a bad person. But what if she was wrong? She thought about the officer's words again, "Sometimes, things aren't what they seem." What wasn't she seeing? The next few days passed uneventfully, but the tension never left. At school, Emily felt like everyone was watching her, even though no one seemed to know about the police visit. At home, her mom was quieter than usual, her worry evident in the way she hovered around Emily and Tyler. Then, on Friday afternoon, everything changed. Emily was walking home from school when she noticed a black car parked at the end of her street. As she approached, the car door opened, and a man in a suit stepped out. "Emily Dawson?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. Emily stopped in her tracks. "Who are you?" The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a badge. "Special Agent Carter," he said. "FBI. We need to talk." Emily's pulse quickened as the officer's words sunk in. "But how?" she stammered. "I didn't see him write anything. I didn't even know his name until now." Her mother set the mug down, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the couch. "Emily, are you sure there's nothing else you remember? Anything at all?" Emily shook her head slowly. "No. He just looked tired and sad. I thought he needed a meal, not that." She paused, her voice trembling. "Not that he was in trouble." The second officer, a woman with sharp eyes but a softer tone, spoke up. "Emily, we believe Daniel Harper might have been trying to get a message to someone. Your act of kindness gave him a chance he didn't have before. Whatever's happening, you've become a part of it." "A part of it?" Emily felt a lump in her throat. She was just an ordinary girl, not someone who got involved in missing persons cases or mysteries. "What does this have to do with me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The officers exchanged another look, their expressions unreadable. Finally, the male officer said, "We think Daniel might have chosen you because you seemed trustworthy. Someone who wouldn't question helping him. He must have written that note when you weren't looking." Emily's mother stood abruptly, her protective instincts flaring. "So what happens now? My daughter doesn't deserve to be dragged into something dangerous. She was just being kind." "We understand, ma'am," the female officer replied. "We're not here to accuse anyone. But Daniel's message and the circumstances surrounding his disappearance are tied to an ongoing investigation. It's possible Emily might know more than she realizes, even without meaning to." Emily's head spun. She clenched her fists, trying to focus. If he needed help so badly, why didn't he just tell me? "Why a note?" The officer sighed. "Because he's likely being watched. Daniel Harper vanished under circumstances that suggest foul play. He couldn't risk saying too much aloud, not even to someone as kind as you." Emily sat down heavily on the arm of the couch, her thoughts racing. Was I just in the wrong place at the wrong time or the right place at the wrong time? The officers left shortly after, promising to stay in touch if they learned anything new. Emily's mother hovered over her for the rest of the evening, watching her like she might disappear at any moment. "I'm fine, Mom," Emily said for the 100th time. But the truth was, she wasn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel's face, the weariness in his expression, the way he had thanked her like she'd done more than hand over a sandwich. That night, as Emily lay in bed, she replayed the moment in her mind over and over. Was there something she'd missed? A gesture, a look, anything. And then it hit her. The lunchbox. She shot up in bed, her heart racing. The police had it now, but she remembered the way Daniel had held it. He hadn't just taken it, he'd clutched it tightly, like it was more than just a box of food. Emily scrambled for her phone, pulling up the internet browser. She searched Daniel Harper missing and immediately found an article. His photo stared back at her, the same weary eyes she'd seen at the bus stop. But the headline made her stomach drop. "Missing local journalist feared dead after investigating corporate scandal." Emily's eyes widened. He wasn't just anyone, he was a journalist. A journalist who had been digging into something dangerous. Her hands trembled as she read further. The article described Daniel Harper as a reporter who had been investigating a powerful company accused of corruption. He had gone missing shortly after publishing a damning article about their illegal activities. Emily whispered to herself, "What have I gotten into?" The next morning, Emily could barely focus at school. The words from the article kept spinning in her head. She wanted to talk to someone, anyone, but who could she trust? Even Rachel's usual bullying felt distant and meaningless. "Hey, charity girl." Rachel sneered as Emily walked past. "Lost your lunchbox yet?" Emily ignored her, her mind elsewhere. At lunch, she found herself sitting alone again, but this time she welcomed the isolation. She opened her notebook, scribbling down everything she remembered about her encounter with Daniel. His expression. The note. The way he had looked over his shoulder before she walked away. And then she wrote the most important question: what does he want me to do? As if on cue, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and froze. It was an unknown number. With shaking hands, she answered. "Hello. Emily," a deep, hushed voice said. "Don't say my name. Just listen." Her breath caught. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes," he said. "I don't have much time. They're watching me." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. "What's going on? Why are the police looking for you? Why did you give me that note?" Daniel's voice was urgent. "I can't explain everything right now, but you need to understand what I'm involved in is dangerous. That note was meant to get the attention of the authorities. I didn't think they'd involve you, but now that they have, you need to be careful." "Careful of what?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "Of them," Daniel said. "The people I was investigating. They'll stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. And if they think you know something..." Emily's stomach churned. "But I don't know anything. I just gave you my lunchbox." "That doesn't matter," Daniel said. "They don't take chances. You need to stay alert. Watch your surroundings. And if anything feels off, you contact the police immediately." Emily's mind spun. This wasn't her life. This wasn't supposed to happen to her. "But why me?" she asked desperately. "Why did you choose me?" Daniel hesitated. "Because you reminded me of someone I used to know. Someone who believed in doing the right thing, no matter the cost." Before Emily could respond, the line went dead. The rest of the day passed in a fog. Emily couldn't concentrate in class, couldn't focus on anything except Daniel's warning. That evening, as she walked home, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following her. Every sound, every shadow made her jump. When she reached her house, she glanced over her shoulder one last time. The street was empty, but her unease didn't fade. Inside, her mom was cooking dinner, the familiar smells bringing a small sense of comfort. But as Emily sat at the table, the unease returned. She glanced out the window and froze. A car was parked across the street, its engine idling. The windows were tinted, and she couldn't see who was inside. "Mom," she whispered. "Do we know anyone with a black car?" Her mom looked up, confused. "No." "Why?" Emily pointed to the window. Her mom's expression darkened as she walked over and peeked outside. The car's engine roared, and it sped away. "Emily," her mom said, her voice tight. "We need to call the police." The phone call to the police came later that evening. Emily's heart raced as she watched the space outside their house, half expecting the car to return, but it didn't. It wasn't just the car that made her uneasy, it was the realization that something had shifted in her life. Something she couldn't undo. By the time the officer arrived, the car had long since disappeared into the darkness. Emily's mother was already pacing around the living room, unable to sit still. She felt a sense of dread she couldn't shake. The officer was polite, but his eyes held concern. "We'll keep an eye on things around here," he assured them. "If you see anything suspicious, don't hesitate to call. I know this is unsettling, but we'll make sure you're safe." Emily nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. This was all too strange. Too sudden. A simple act of kindness had spiraled into something dangerous. "Emily," her mother said, her voice low, "are you sure there's nothing else you're hiding?" "Nothing else Daniel told you?" Emily swallowed, her throat dry. "No. I didn't tell you everything, Mom, but I spoke to him. On the phone." Her mother's eyes widened. "What? You spoke to him? When?" "Today, during school," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He called me. He warned me to stay alert, to be careful. He said they were watching me." Her mother's face paled. "Who's watching you? What does that mean?" "I don't know," Emily replied, her words tumbling out faster than she could catch them. "He wouldn't say. He just told me to be careful and to trust no one." The officer shifted uneasily, glancing between Emily and her mother. "This isn't normal, that's for sure. We'll have a patrol car come by every few hours, but I think it's best if you stay close to home for now. Keep a phone on you at all times." Emily nodded, her stomach tightening. She felt more isolated than ever before. The life she knew, the safety she took for granted, was slipping away, piece by piece. The days that followed felt like a blur of constant unease. Emily couldn't remember the last time she had slept properly. Every creak of the floorboards, every knock at the door made her jump. At school, she was distracted, finding it hard to focus on anything. Her friends, if she could even call them that, seemed to notice. Rachel's taunts were getting sharper, more personal. It didn't matter now, Emily's mind was consumed by the larger mystery unfolding. The police had come by a few more times, but nothing had changed. No one seemed to know where Daniel was or who he was running from. Every night, Emily sat by the window, watching the street, waiting for the car to return. The night felt longer, as if time itself was stretching to accommodate her fears. At school, things were no better. In fact, they were worse. Rachel, emboldened by the lack of real attention from the teachers, now took to spreading rumors about Emily. "Did you hear?" she'd giggle loudly as she passed by Emily's desk. "Emily gave a homeless man her lunchbox, and now she's got the police involved. What a weirdo." The other students laughed, some of them joining in with their own jabs. But Emily had learned to tune them out. At least, she tried. In truth, she was growing numb to the world around her, too wrapped up in the chaos of her own life to worry about the petty cruelty of her classmates. One evening, a week after the unsettling phone call, Emily sat on the couch, staring blankly at the television, her mind far away. The usual hum of the living room, the soft murmur of the television, the gentle clatter of dishes from the kitchen did little to comfort her. It was then that she heard it. A tap on the window. Her heart skipped a beat. Emily leapt to her feet, instinctively looking out into the night. Her hands trembled as she drew the curtains apart just enough to peer outside. There, standing at the corner of the yard, was a figure. She couldn't make out the details in the dim light, but she saw the outline clearly enough: a man. His posture was rigid, and something about his stillness made her blood run cold. Before Emily could move, her phone buzzed. She picked it up with shaking hands, her eyes never leaving the figure outside. Her stomach twisted as she answered. "Emily," Daniel's voice came through the line, low and urgent. "Listen to me. I need you to do something. It's important." "Where are you?" she asked, her voice breaking. I can't tell you that. But they're close. The people I've been investigating, they know you're involved now. They're going to come for you. What do I do? Emily asked, panic rising in her chest. She could hear the sound of her own breath, ragged, frantic. Get out of the house, Daniel said quickly. Not to the police, not to anyone. You can't trust them. They'll be watching. You need to go. Now. Before she could respond, the line went dead. The world seemed to slow around her. The figure outside. The warning. Everything felt like it was closing in. She glanced back at the window, but the figure had vanished. Mom! Emily called out, her voice trembling. Mom, we need to leave. But as she turned to run, her mother's voice came from behind her. Emily, what's happening? Emily froze, her body stiff with fear. There, in the doorway, stood a man. Not the one outside, but someone else, someone wearing a dark jacket and a cap pulled low over his face. Who are you? Emily demanded, but her voice shook with fear. The man didn't respond. He just stepped forward, his hand moving towards something inside his coat. No! Emily screamed. She backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. What do you want? He raised his hand, but not toward her. Instead, he pulled out a piece of paper, slowly unfolding it. And there, written on it in bold letters, were the words. Get out, Emily. It's too late. Emily's breath hitched. The note. The same handwriting from the lunchbox. It was a message from Daniel. And the man? He wasn't here for her, he was here to deliver the message. Without a second thought, Emily turned and ran. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away from this man, from whatever danger was closing in on her. Her mother's shouts faded as Emily sprinted down the street, barely noticing the cold air biting at her skin. She didn't stop until her legs burned, until she couldn't run anymore. In the distance, she could see the glow of the streetlights, but she didn't want to stop. And that's when she heard it. The unmistakable sound of tires on gravel, followed by a low hum of an engine. They were after her. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The man she had helped at the bus stop, the one who had set this entire chain of events in motion, was now standing in her living room. His clothes were still tattered, his face gaunt, but his eyes were alive with urgency and fear. The officers hesitated for a moment before lowering their weapons slightly. Mr. Harper, one of them said, his tone measured but firm. You're a wanted man. We've been looking for you for years. You need to explain yourself. Daniel held up his hands, showing he was unarmed. I will. But first, I need to make something very clear. He turned to Emily, his expression softening for a moment. You didn't just save a hungry man. You might have saved countless lives. Emily blinked, her mind racing to process his words. I don't understand. What's going on? Why did you choose me? Daniel took a deep breath, glancing around the room as if checking for unseen threats. Because you're the only one who's been overlooked, underestimated. That makes you the perfect ally. And because they would never suspect someone like you. The room fell silent as Daniel began his story. Years ago, he had worked as a data analyst for a powerful corporation, a company that seemed legitimate on the surface but was deeply corrupt beneath. They were laundering money, funding illegal operations, and silencing anyone who dared to question them. Daniel had stumbled upon the evidence by accident, a series of coded transactions that didn't add up. I couldn't ignore it, he said, his voice heavy with regret. I gathered everything I could and went public. But I underestimated them. They found out before I could release all the files. They destroyed my life. He paused, looking down at his hands. I went into hiding, trying to stay one step ahead of them. But it's not just about me. They're still out there, hurting people, controlling lives. I've been trying to bring them down ever since. Emily stared at him, her mind reeling. But what does that have to do with me? Why now? Daniel met her gaze. Because I'm out of time. They're closing in, and I can't do this alone anymore. I slipped that note into your lunchbox because I saw something in you, a kindness, a courage most people don't have. I hoped you'd help me without even realizing it. Emily's head spun. She had gone from an invisible high schooler to the unwitting accomplice of a fugitive in a matter of days. But why didn't you just go to the police? She asked, glancing at the officers, who still seemed wary. Daniel shook his head. Not all of them can be trusted. This corporation has deep pockets and even deeper connections. I needed someone they wouldn't see coming. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small, weathered USB drive. This is everything I've managed to collect over the years, he said, holding it out. Names, transactions, locations. It's enough to take them down, but I can't get it to the right people without being caught. That's where you come in. Emily stared at the drive, her heart pounding. Me? I'm just a kid. How am I supposed to help? You're not just a kid, Daniel said firmly. You're smart, resourceful, and, most importantly, you have nothing to lose. They don't know who you are, and that gives you an advantage. One of the officers stepped forward, his face a mix of skepticism and concern. Mr. Harper, this is highly irregular. If this evidence is as explosive as you claim, it needs to go through the proper channels. Daniel nodded. I know. But I've seen what happens to people who trust the wrong channels. That's why I need her. Emily, you're my last hope. Emily's hands shook as she took the USB drive. It felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the weight of everything Daniel had endured. What do I do? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. There's a journalist, Anna Rivera. She's one of the few people who's not afraid to take on stories like this. She works in the city, at the Beacon. You need to get this to her. Emily felt a surge of panic. The city was hours away, and she had never done anything remotely this risky. But how do I? You'll figure it out, Daniel interrupted, his tone urgent. You have to. They'll come after me as soon as they realize I'm not where they expect. That'll buy you some time, but not much. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. We need to escort her, one of them said. This is too dangerous. Daniel shook his head. No. That'll draw attention. She needs to go alone. Emily's mother, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. She's not going anywhere alone, she said firmly. She's my daughter. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Fine. But you have to keep a low profile. No phones, no credit cards. They can track all of it. Emily looked at her mother, who gave her a small, reassuring nod. We'll do this together, her mother said. Whatever it takes. The next morning, Emily and her mother packed what little they could carry and left before sunrise. The streets were eerily quiet, the weight of the mission pressing down on them. Emily clutched the USB drive in her pocket, her fingers wrapped tightly around it. As they drove toward the city, the tension in the car was palpable. Emily kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a black car following them. Her mother's knuckles were white as she gripped the steering wheel. Halfway there, Emily's worst fears came true. A dark SUV appeared in the distance, gaining on them fast. Mom, she said, her voice shaking. They're coming. Her mother glanced in the mirror, her expression hardening. Hold on. What followed was a blur of screeching tires, sharp turns, and narrow escapes. Emily's heart felt like it was about to burst as they weaved through back roads and alleys, desperately trying to lose their pursuers. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they managed to slip away, parking the car in a crowded lot and blending into the throngs of people heading into the city. Emily clutched her mother's hand as they made their way toward the beacon. When they finally reached the newsroom, Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. They found Ana Rivera sitting at her desk, surrounded by stacks of papers and a glowing computer screen. "Ms. Rivera," Emily said, her voice trembling. "We have something you need to see." Ana looked up, her eyes narrowing as she took in their disheveled appearance. "What is this about?" Emily handed her the USB drive. "It's everything. Proof of corruption, illegal operations, everything Daniel Harper risked his life for." Anna's expression shifted from skepticism to shock as she plugged the drive into her computer. The screen lit up with files, each one more damning than the last. "This," Anna whispered, her voice trailing off. "This could bring down an empire." As the weight of her words sank in, Emily felt a strange mix of fear and pride. She had done it. Against all odds, she had delivered the truth. In the days that followed, the story broke wide open. The corporation's leaders were exposed, arrests were made, and the world finally saw the extent of their crimes. Daniel's name was cleared, though he remained in hiding, his safety still uncertain. For Emily, life would never be the same. She was no longer invisible. She had faced danger, uncovered secrets, and stood up for what was right. And in doing so, she had found a strength she never knew she had. As she walked through the crowded school hallway one morning, she noticed something different. The whispers and stares were still there, but this time, they weren't mocking. They were curious. Respectful. Emily Dawson had changed the world. And she wasn't done yet. The days following the reveal were a whirlwind for Emily. Her quiet life, once marked by obscurity and ridicule, had been thrust into a storm of attention and change. The story spread like wildfire. News outlets broadcasted the takedown of the corrupt corporation, praising Daniel Harper's bravery and the unexpected heroism of a teenage girl who had played an integral role. Emily, however, didn't feel like a hero. Every step of the journey had been terrifying, uncertain, and fraught with danger. She had barely slept since delivering the USB drive to Ana Rivera. Every sound outside her window at night made her jump. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching, waiting for her to slip up. The corruption exposed by Ana Rivera's reporting sent shockwaves through the world. Executives at the company were arrested, their wealth and power unable to shield them from justice. Investigators unearthed layers of illegal operations, human trafficking, embezzlement, and ties to violent criminal organizations. The public was outraged, demanding accountability at every level. For Emily, the consequences hit closer to home. The morning after the story broke, her school was abuzz. She walked into the building with her head held high, but she couldn't ignore the murmurs around her. Students who had once ignored or mocked her now watched her with a mix of awe and curiosity. "Is it true? Did you really meet Daniel Harper?" someone asked as she passed by. "How did you get involved in all this?" another voice chimed in. Emily tried to ignore them, focusing on the path to her classroom. But her teacher, Mrs. Lyman, stopped her at the door. "Emily," she said softly, her usual stern expression replaced with something gentler. "Can we talk for a moment?" Mrs. Lyman led Emily into the empty classroom and closed the door behind them. "I saw the news," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "I had no idea you were going through something so intense." Emily shrugged, unsure how to respond. "It wasn't exactly planned." Mrs. Lyman smiled faintly. "I always knew there was something special about you, Emily. You've always been quiet, but not because you lack confidence. It's because you observe. You think. That's a rare quality." Emily looked down at her hands, unsure what to say. She wasn't used to praise, especially from someone like Mrs. Lyman. "I just did what I thought was right," she said finally. "And that's exactly why it mattered," Mrs. Lyman replied. "You stood up when it counted, even though you were scared. That's what makes a true hero." Meanwhile, Daniel Harper's situation remained precarious. Though the public hailed him as a whistleblower and a hero, the corporation's remaining loyalists were still a threat. Rumors swirled that mercenaries had been hired to silence him for good. Emily worried about him constantly, wondering if he was safe or if he regretted involving her. One evening, as she sat at the kitchen table with her mother, she voiced her concerns. "Do you think Daniel will ever be able to live a normal life again?" Her mother, who had been quietly sipping tea, set her cup down. "I don't know, Emily. But I do know that people like him like you don't do what they do for normalcy. They do it because it's the right thing to do, no matter the cost." Emily nodded, though the weight of those words pressed heavily on her chest. She wasn't sure she was ready to live a life defined by sacrifice and danger. Just as Emily began to settle into her new reality, another shock came. One afternoon, while she was at home, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You think this is over?" "It's not." Her blood ran cold. She showed the message to her mother, who immediately called the police. The officers assured them that it was likely an empty threat, the desperate act of someone loyal to the corporation's cause. But Emily wasn't convinced. She began to notice small things: a car parked near her house for too long, a figure lingering at the edge of the schoolyard. Every little detail felt like a sign that she was being watched. The fear that had once subsided came rushing back. Despite the looming threat, Emily refused to let fear control her. She threw herself into her schoolwork, determined to prove to herself and everyone else that she could rise above the chaos. She also began volunteering at a local shelter, inspired by her encounter with Daniel Harper and the difference a single act of kindness could make. At the shelter, she met people from all walks of life: those who had lost everything, those fighting to rebuild, and those who, like her, had found themselves caught in something much bigger than they had ever imagined. Their stories gave her perspective and strength. One day, while serving meals, she noticed a familiar figure sitting at one of the tables. Her heart skipped a beat. It was Daniel Harper. Daniel looked up and met her gaze, a small smile playing on his lips. He looked healthier, though still weary, as if he hadn't slept in weeks. Emily approached cautiously, unsure what to say. "You're a hard person to find," she said finally. Daniel chuckled softly. "That's the idea." They sat together, and Daniel told her about his life since the story broke. He had been moving constantly, staying one step ahead of those who still wanted him silenced. But he was determined to keep fighting. "You've inspired me, you know," he said, surprising her. "Me?" Emily asked, incredulous. Daniel nodded. "You could have walked away. Most people would have. But you didn't. You remind me that there's still good in the world, even when it feels like it's falling apart." Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. She had spent so much time doubting herself, wondering if she had done the right thing, if she was strong enough for this. Hearing those words from Daniel meant more than she could express. As they parted ways, Daniel left her with a promise. "Keep being who you are, Emily. The world needs more people like you." Those words stayed with her as she continued to navigate her new reality. The threats didn't disappear overnight, and the attention she received from her classmates and the media eventually faded. But something inside her had changed. Emily Dawson was no longer invisible. She was no longer just the quiet girl in the back row. She was someone who had made a difference, someone who had stood up when it mattered most. And as she walked through the halls of her school, her head held high, she knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning of her story. The downfall of the crime syndicate started small, like a pebble dropping into a pond, but the ripples quickly grew into waves. Daniel's testimony, combined with the evidence retrieved from the USB drive, became the cornerstone of the investigation. It exposed not just the shadowy figures who had been chasing him but also a network of corruption that stretched into corporate boardrooms and government offices. Arrests were made in cities far beyond Emily's small town. Executives, politicians, and enforcers who had long operated above the law were finally brought to justice. For years, they had thrived on fear and control, but now their empire was crumbling. The media celebrated it as a monumental victory, calling it one of the largest takedowns of organized crime in decades. The story headlined national news. Teenager's act of kindness unravels a criminal empire. For Emily, the sudden attention felt overwhelming. Journalists camped outside her house, eager to interview the girl who had unknowingly become part of a massive operation. They called her brave, selfless, and extraordinary. But Emily didn't feel extraordinary. "I just gave someone my lunchbox," she said to a reporter one day. It was true. She hadn't set out to change the world or expose criminals, she had simply seen a hungry man and helped him. The idea that her small gesture had sparked such a massive change was still hard to comprehend. At school, things were different too. The same kids who had once mocked her now wanted to sit with her at lunch, hoping to be associated with the girl on TV. Emily, however, wasn't interested in popularity. She stayed true to herself, spending her breaks in the library or helping Mrs. Lyman organize books. Her mother, once worried about how Emily's involvement might endanger their family, grew proud of her daughter's courage. "You have a good heart, Emily," she said one evening as they shared dinner. "Never let the world take that away from you." One by one, the trials of those involved in the syndicate began. Emily didn't attend them, she didn't want to face the dangerous people who had threatened her and Daniel. But she followed the news closely. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses came forward, emboldened by the downfall of their oppressors. Financial records, intercepted communications, and Daniel's testimony painted a damning picture of the organization's reach and crimes. Among those convicted was the CEO of a multinational company who had used his position to launder money for the syndicate. The man who had ordered the hit on Daniel received a life sentence. Justice, it seemed, was finally being served. Daniel Harper's life transformed as well. With the danger largely neutralized, he no longer had to live in constant fear. The government granted him protection under a whistleblower program, providing him with a new identity and a fresh start. But before he left, he made sure to thank Emily properly. One sunny afternoon, as Emily and her mother sat on their porch, a car pulled into their driveway. Daniel stepped out, holding a small package. "I couldn't leave without saying goodbye," he said, smiling warmly. "And without giving you this." Emily opened the package to find a simple gold necklace with a small charm shaped like a book. "It reminded me of you," he said. Quiet, thoughtful, but with a story that has the power to change lives. Emily's throat tightened with emotion. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly. "I did," Daniel replied. "Because you remind me that even in the darkest times, there's light. You gave me hope when I thought there was none." After Daniel left, life slowly began to settle for Emily. The media attention faded, the journalists moved on to new stories, and her town returned to its quiet routines. But Emily was not the same girl she had been before. She carried herself with more confidence, her head held high as she walked through the halls at school. She no longer cared about the whispers or stares. She had learned that strength didn't come from blending in but from standing up for what was right. Her teachers began to notice the change. Mrs. Lyman, in particular, saw how Emily had grown. "You've always been a bright student," she told her one day after class. "But now, you're also a leader." Emily wasn't sure about being a leader, but she knew one thing: she wanted to keep making a difference. She began volunteering at local charities, inspired by her experience with Daniel. Whether it was serving meals at a shelter or tutoring younger students, she found joy in helping others. The events of those few weeks left an indelible mark on Emily's town. People began to see her not as the quiet girl who wore second-hand clothes but as a symbol of kindness and courage. The local diner where her mother worked started a pay-it-forward board, where customers could buy meals for those in need. The community rallied around the idea, inspired by Emily's simple act of giving her lunchbox to a stranger. Even Emily's classmates changed. Some of them joined her in volunteering, while others simply stopped mocking those who were different. The ripple effect of her actions continued, touching lives in ways Emily couldn't always see. As Emily prepared for her final year of high school, she began to think about what she wanted to do next. She had always loved books and dreamed of becoming a writer, but now she felt a new pull to tell stories that mattered, to shine a light on the people and issues that often went unnoticed. One day, she sat down with her notebook and wrote the first line of her story. It all started with a lunchbox. She didn't know where her journey would take her, but she knew one thing: she would keep following her heart, no matter where it led. Emily Dawson's name faded from the headlines, but her story lived on in the lives she had touched. She didn't seek fame or recognition, she simply wanted to do what was right. And in doing so, she proved that even the smallest acts of kindness can spark the greatest change. In the end, Emily remained the quiet girl with the big heart. But now, she knew the power of her own voice and she was ready to use it. As Emily walked home one evening, the setting sun cast a warm, golden glow across her small town. The cool autumn breeze rustled through the trees, sending leaves swirling gently across the sidewalk. She had just finished another long day at school, but her mind wasn't focused on homework or the latest gossip. Instead, it was filled with memories of a time not long ago when her life had been completely different. She found herself walking past the same bus stop where she had first met Daniel. It was empty now, just a small bench and a weathered pole standing quietly in the fading light. There was no sign of the man who had once sat there, asking for help, his cardboard sign barely visible beneath layers of old clothes. She paused for a moment, her hand brushing against the rough surface of the bus stop sign as if trying to hold onto the moment. Emily smiled softly, a quiet, knowing smile. It was hard to believe how much had changed in such a short time. Just a few months ago, she had been a girl who blended into the background, unnoticed and alone. Now, she had witnessed firsthand how one small act of kindness could create a ripple effect that transformed not just her life, but the lives of many others. As she stood there, a sudden thought crossed her mind. Sometimes, the smallest actions have the power to create the biggest changes. It was a truth she had learned the hard way, and it had become one of the guiding principles in her life. She could remember the first time she had seen Daniel at that bus stop, how his eyes had looked tired, worn from life's struggles. She hadn't known anything about him, his past, his troubles, or the danger he was in. All she had known was that he was hungry, and that was enough for her to act. She had given him her lunchbox without thinking twice, not knowing that the simple gesture would set off a chain of events that would unravel a criminal empire, change the course of her life, and turn her into a symbol of bravery and hope. Emily had often thought back to that moment, wondering if she would have done the same thing if she had known the risks. But in the end, it didn't matter. She had helped, and that decision had made all the difference. As she continued walking, Emily reflected on everything that had happened since that fateful day. It wasn't just about the crime syndicate that had been taken down or the people who had been arrested. It wasn't about the attention she had received or the newfound respect from her classmates. What mattered most was how she had learned to see the world differently, to see that even in a world that often felt overwhelming and unfair, there was always room for kindness. She thought about how many times people had underestimated her in the past. She had been judged by her clothes, her quiet nature, and her humble background. But none of that defined her. What defined her was her heart. The way she cared for others, the way she took action when it was needed, and the way she stood up for what was right. Now, as she walked along the same streets she had walked for years, she saw them with new eyes. There was beauty in the small moments, the way the light hit the trees just so, the laughter of children playing in the park, and the gentle hum of life in her town. Everything felt different, not because the world had changed, but because she had changed. She had learned to see the power of kindness and the ripple effects it could create. She had also learned something else, something perhaps even more important. Sometimes, giving someone your lunchbox doesn't just change their life, it changes yours too. In giving without expecting anything in return, she had found a deeper sense of purpose and meaning. She had learned that even the smallest gestures of kindness could be powerful enough to inspire others, to make a difference, and to change the world in ways she never could have imagined. Emily thought back to how everyone had reacted when they heard her story. At first, she had been uncomfortable with all the attention. She hadn't wanted to be seen as a hero or a symbol of something greater. But as the weeks went on, she realized that it wasn't about her, it was about the message her actions had sent. That kindness mattered. That standing up for others mattered. That doing the right thing, even when it seemed small or insignificant, could make a world of difference. As she neared her house, Emily felt a sense of peace settle over her. The past few months had been a whirlwind, but they had also been a lesson in courage, strength, and resilience. She had learned that doing the right thing wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. She had also learned that sometimes, the hardest moments in life lead to the greatest growth. As Emily stepped up onto the porch, she paused for a moment, looking out at the stars beginning to twinkle in the evening sky. It felt like everything had fallen into place. Her life, which had once felt ordinary and quiet, now had meaning beyond what she had ever imagined. She had made a difference, and that was enough. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening. Her mother stood there, smiling warmly. "How was school today?" she asked. Emily grinned, walking inside. "It was good. Just, good. Same as always." Her mother raised an eyebrow. "You know, you've become a bit of a local legend around here, right?" Emily laughed, a soft chuckle escaping her lips. "Yeah, I know. I've heard." "Well, just remember," her mother said, "it's the quiet ones who often have the most powerful impact." Emily smiled, thinking back to the lessons she had learned. It was true. The quiet ones, the ones who didn't seek attention, the ones who acted from the heart, those were the people who made the world a better place. As she sat down at the dinner table with her mother, Emily felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had given her lunchbox to a stranger, not expecting anything in return, and in doing so, she had changed the course of her life. It was a reminder that even in the face of uncertainty, kindness always has the power to create change. The world may not always notice the small things, the quiet acts of courage and kindness that happen in the background, but Emily knew the truth now. Those small moments were the ones that truly mattered. And in the end, they were the ones that shaped the world. Sometimes, it takes just one act of kindness to change everything. And that one act can change not just someone else's life, but your own as well.